Hello, I'm Renée Fleming. Welcome to Music and Mind Live. This week, we're going to go deeper into some of our brain's emotional responses to music and how music can unlock secrets of cognition. We have two amazing experts joining us this afternoon. Music therapist and professor Dr. Sheri Robb of the Indiana University School of Nursing is internationally recognized for her expertise in pediatric music therapy and behavioral intervention research. She is a member of the NEA-sponsored Sound Health Network leadership team at UCSF, which was a focus of an earlier episode of Music and Mind Live. And she'll be discussing the impact of music therapy on a topic that is definitely not on our minds right now, stress and anxiety. We will also be exploring her research on the benefits of active music making to manage both parent and child stress during cancer treatment. In addition, joining us is renowned neuroscientist Dr. Robert Zatorre, who holds a Canada Research Chair in Auditory Cognitive Neuroscience at the Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University. Together with his many students and collaborators, he has published over 300 scientific papers on topics including pitch perception, auditory imagery, music production, and brain plasticity. He's perhaps best known for discovering how the brain's reward system results in musical pleasure. In 2006, he co-founded the International Laboratory for Brain, Music, and Sound Research, BRAMS, a unique multi-university consortium dedicated to the cognitive neuroscience of music. He's the recipient of numerous prizes in research, including just last week, the esteemed Carvalho-Heineken Prize in Cognitive Science in Amsterdam for his contribution to the discipline of music cognition. So before we begin, a reminder to submit questions in the comments section of my Facebook page. We're nearing the end of the program with only 2 more episodes, and I'm so grateful for your interest and engagement. Welcome, Sheri and Robert. And beginning with Robert. Robert, you've looked at pitch, melodic perception, and absolute pitch, bilingual pitch perception, and on and on. Why did you immerse yourself in these subjects, and were you able to follow your own curiosity in choosing these topics, going back to 1979?
Yes, well, I was really very, very fortunate to be in a position where I could explore these topics, which at the time were not exactly mainstream, let's say. But I mean, the reason I went into this was partly personal because I had studied music and science. I always thought both of these domains were incredibly important to me. And when I decided to go into a real science career, I didn't really want to just abandon the music. And I realized at some point that music is an entry point into all of the most complex aspects of human cognition. So it allows us to study not only perception, but also memory, also the control of the motor system and attention and social interactions, and of course, emotion. And so it's a very, very, very rich area of study. And by using music, we gain insight into how the brain actually works. And I think also by understanding how the brain works in music, we also gain insight into music. And that's been sort of the approach I've taken over the years.
Huh, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that makes perfect sense that it touches on all of those things. So, in a previous episode of Music and Mind Live, Dr. Ani Patel discussed the connections between music and human evolution. Robert, what function has music played in our evolution? Is it something innate like speech or more of an invention like writing?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. And Ani Patel is a very good friend of mine. We've talked about this over many a beer. And I sort of like his idea that um, it may not have originally been selected for in evolution. Um, a lot of other things were selected for that allow us to have music, like the ability to manipulate objects with our very fine dexterity, and our auditory capacities that allow us to navigate the world and interpret complex sounds. Once all of these things were in place, however, then they can all come together. And then once you do have music, it does actually have a lot of adaptive significance. We can obviously use it to communicate. And one of the key things that I would say is that unlike speech, which is primarily, not always, but it's primarily to communicate information, to tell you about how to do things and where to find things and who did what to whom, music is more about communicating emotion. And that's possibly its most important function.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how the brain processes music?
Well, it's I like to sort of joke when we sort of like to I sort of like to say, well, it's everything above the neck because again, it engages so many different parts of our nervous system. So what we try to do when we do research is to identify particular subcomponents that are relevant for music, and then try to figure out what are the circuits that are involved in those specific components. So, for example, one thing that we can do is look at very precise ability that we have to distinguish different pitches. This is particularly important for music, and it's not so important for speech. You can have speech variations in pitch, but unless you're singing like you would do, Renee, um, the exact pitch value is not so important. The trajectory might be important, but hitting the exact note is not so important when you're speaking. On the other hand, it is absolutely critical when you are doing music. And when we probe the brain to see what is the circuitry that underlies that particular ability, we find that there's an area of the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, especially on the right side, that seems to be responsible for encoding these very, very fine-grained pitch differences. So that would be possibly the starting point in the entire access that music has to the brain. It sort of goes in through the ear, goes through several parts of the brainstem and so forth, and eventually gets to this region of the auditory cortex where the real musical information begins to be processed. And then from then on, it expands to a whole complex circuit. And I do have a slide we could show to illustrate this, perhaps. Let me see which slide it is. I guess it would be slide number 5, if we want to show that.
Thank you. I mean, you also reference the imagery of sound, and is that how does sound become an image?
Yeah, well, this is an amazing ability that almost all of us have. Musicians have it to a very great extent, highly developed, but you don't have to be a musician to close your eyes and hear one of your favorite melodies, or even a simple melody, like anyone can close their eyes and imagine the sound of Happy Birthday. And you can imagine it sung by, your child, or you can imagine it sung by your grandfather. So we all have this remarkable skill.
That's how I know I have something memorized, when I can hear the opera and complete every scene that I'm in, all the other roles, etc.
Yes.
It takes a little bit of time, but then you know it.
And when we look at the brain, we see that those same regions that I mentioned before that are representing sound, when you perceive different pitches and their as I mentioned, the fine-grained ability to distinguish those sounds, those same areas of the brain are actually also active when, in the absence of sound, when you are consciously imagining the same pattern. So it's as if the information is stored in there, and you can willfully call it to mind, um, and then experience the sound in a way similar to the way that you initially first heard it. This is an amazing capacity that we have. It's linked to our memory, of course, because as you mentioned, you've memorized the whole piece of music. But it's not just that the information is there, it's sort of actively replayed, as it were, while you're imagining.
So I think I always thought or assumed that our appreciation for music comes out of language, and sort of this perception that we have of really thinking about someone's tone. Is it familiar? Is it angry? Is it happy? You know, these types of things. The same words will sound very differently depending on your tone. So, however, I was shocked to discover that speech and music actually live in different parts of the brain. Can you tell us why you think that is?
Yeah, well, there are some common elements, and there are some distinct elements between speech and music. From our work and that of other people, we find that there are differences in the way that the different elements of speech and music are handled. So as I mentioned, in the case of pitch, in the case of music, pitch is particularly important. And so you need a specialized circuit that is going to be able to handle that. On the other hand, when we speak, there are elements of speech which are particularly important that are known as temporal modulations. So the way that the sound is shaped as we speak by the opening and closing of our lips and our vocal tract, um, that generates a different kind of sound pattern, which requires a different kind of analysis. And so from our work, we find that a lot of that temporal analysis is handled on the left side. So kind of symmetrical regions doing parallel analysis. And when someone like you is singing an aria, both of them are simultaneously active because you want to be able to follow the pattern of pitches that correspond to the melody, but you also might want to understand the words. And for that, you need this other mechanism on the left. Eventually, of course, they integrate and they are working together.
It sounds like it's great for brain health, actually, to get that much activity. So your slides are actually showing up on the stream. So why don't you take
Yeah,
us through what it looks like in a musician's brain when we're performing music?
right. So in this slide that you can see here, what we're illustrating is sort of the input of the sound that's coming in through the ear, and then it does go through several different stages before it gets to the cortex. The cortex being the sort of outer region, and then you see these loops that are indicated by those arrows. So these are anatomical connections between the auditory part of the brain, which is the region that I mentioned, and all of these other areas. So the information is sent along these different pathways, and these pathways enable a lot of different functions. And in particular, when you are trained to perform music, you have an especially strong coupling between the part of the brain that handles the input, which is the sound, and the part of the brain that handles the output, which is the control over the muscles. So if you're playing, as illustrated in the image, violin, for example, you need to articulate the bow and the fingers in a very, very precise way. And that's actually illustrated in the video that we have here, which is actually a nice demonstration of how carefully a musician is able to move their arms and their fingers and their hands as they play their instrument. This is a video taken from a motion capture of a violinist playing one of the Bach partitas, and comes from one of my colleagues at McGill. And what's beautiful about it is not only the sound, but also as you see the pattern of the movements, you'll notice that there are little circles and there are little figure eights that all represent the exact motion as the musician is very, very carefully balancing their bow and drawing it across the strings. If
We can
play
play that. Jason, you'll have to let us know when it's over because we can't see it. Super. I remember hearing, looking at the video before, and it's actually quite beautiful. So we're sort of short on time now. Can you just explain to us a little bit about the work you're doing now, how music relates to pleasure and reward in the brain?
Yes, so we also have a few slides for that, but I'll go through them fairly quickly. If we could go to slide number 8. So I've been talking about these loops that I illustrated in that figure, and those are the regions, the circuitry I would say that is involved in perception and production of music, and linking together all those different elements, including memory. But when we talk about the so-called reward system, we're talking about a totally different part of the brain. So it's not the outer region of the cortex. There are these very deep structures in the brain that are evolutionarily ancient. So we share them with lots of other species. And in particular, there's a structure called the striatum, which we know is especially important for what neuroscientists call rewarding stimuli. So things like food, for example, if you take a hungry rat, you give it food, this part of the brain is active. And if we go to slide 9, we see that the same region is active in human beings when they are experiencing stimuli that are highly pleasurable and rewarding. So if you play a sort of a gambling game, this part of the brain lights up when you receive money. If you get food as well, and also erotic stimuli will activate the same region. Now, these are all the kinds of stimuli that are sort of biologically irrelevant. You need food to survive, and of course, sex is important for the survival of the species. But when we look at music, as shown in slide 10, we also see that the same exact regions are active. The reward areas in the striatum are extremely active when people are experiencing pleasure as they hear music. And this was something we discovered about 20 years ago, but we've been doing a lot more work on it. And it's remarkable because music is not necessarily, strictly speaking, necessary for survival. And it is not a biological reward in the same way that food is. You don't absolutely need it in order to survive. And yet it engages that system. And we can drill down further into this story. If we go to the next slide, which is slide 11, you'll see that there are two different subregions of the striatum. And I won't get into the details, but we find that these regions are active not only when you experience the pleasure, but also as you're anticipating the pleasurable outcome. So there are these moments of anticipation, and those are in themselves pleasurable. And this is super interesting because when we talk about this science, neuroscience work to musicians and people who do music theory, we see, if we go to slide 12, that music theorists have been talking about this for 50 or 60 years. This idea that there is a tension and then there's a resolution. And you, as a performing musician, I'm sure, Renée, you can certainly speak to this, that you exploit these concepts when you are performing. You know about creating tension and creating an expectancy in the listener, and sometimes even delaying that expectation to enhance the pleasure when it finally arrives. So it's a very beautiful sort of link between the neuroscience on the one hand and what musicians have understood both intuitively and also formally when they analyze music, that there is this relationship. And the next slide basically encapsulates the whole global story, if you will, that on the one hand, we have this cortical system of loops that we talked about before, which are responsible for perceiving sounds, for producing those sounds, and for creating these predictions. As you hear one pattern of sound, then you anticipate what's coming next. And on the other hand, you have this very ancient system in the deep structures of the brain, which has to do with reward and pleasure and emotion. And music is remarkable because it really takes both of these systems, the most evolutionary advanced part of our brains, and brings it into synchrony with the most sort of ancient systems that are involved in reward and pleasure. And I think that's why music is so powerful, because it really brings together these, very cognitive, highly evolved systems with these very powerful emotional systems.
Fabulous. Well, we'll come back. We're going to come back to you, Dr. Zatorre, because I definitely want to hear about your COVID study. And let's hear from Sheri now. Welcome. So you're currently looking at the impact of music in a particularly stressful environment during pediatric cancer treatment. So let's start with the video of a patient family talking about the relief of tension that music can bring to both the parent and child.
This has all the materials we need to have fun together.
Here, Dad, I got a dinosaur.
It was a very good experience. It was very uplifting for my son. It was something that we got to do together also. In the hospital, there's not a whole bunch of stuff we can do together. Plus, you're in the room stuck together. He was totally sick of me at the point when the music study started. It honestly brought out something new, fresh. That tension totally went away. I didn't feel it at all after that. He was like brand new. There was points in the study that actually brought happy tears to my eyes, because you don't understand the difference it made in his world. I mean, he went from being extremely miserable to just the happiest kid in the world. Totally. The end result is uplifts spirits for sure.
Sheri, please tell us about this.
Sure. So the research that we're doing right now is focusing on young children ages 3 to 8 and their parents as they're going through cancer treatment. And we know from prior research that as many as 75% of parents and 50% of children experience significantly high levels of emotional distress as they're going through treatment, and the long-term effects of that distress that they experience as they go through treatment for some of our family leads to problems after treatment ends, such as experiences with traumatic stress symptoms. And so what we've been studying over the years is how can we use active music making as a way to help young children manage and regulate that emotional distress they're experiencing. But really interestingly, we know that parent-child distress is interrelated. And so we were noticing that this doesn't just have benefits for the children, but also benefits for the parents. So our study is now looking at, we started out looking at more of the behavioral, psychological, social outcomes of this intervention for these families. But our latest study is going to begin looking at biomarkers of stress and immune function. So it's giving us a chance to really create a very holistic picture of how this intervention and interventions like it may work to lower stress.
So motivational coping theory is the area of your research. Can you tell us what that is and how it impacts how we deal with stress in these situations?
Sure. So when I first started doing work in this area, I've always been interested in coping and children, as well as adults. It's relevant. But I came across some work that was being done in the area of coping and motivation. And this theory of the motivational coping theory really frames stress as we as human beings all have this innate fundamental drive to want to experience success, meaning mastery over our environment. We're also driven to want to be autonomous, to be independent. And then the third thing that we're driven towards is to be in relationship with other people. And I was reading about this theory, and they started to talk about environments that support those drives and environments that don't. And so when those drives get inhibited, we tend to experience stress. And as I read about, well, what are the qualities of environments that are supportive rather than stressful, I thought it really explained what I had been doing clinically with music. So there's a slide that has the 3 qualities of these stressful environments. So stressful environments tend to be chaotic, meaning you can't predict what's going to happen. The second quality is that they tend to constrain your independence. So you don't have many opportunities to feel like you have any control. You don't have any opportunities to make choices. And then the third attribute of stressful environments is that they constrain or they're absent of supportive relationships. So if you're going through an experience and you don't have people there supporting you along the way, you're going to probably experience stress. So in contrast to those, stressful environments are supportive environments. And instead of being chaotic, they tend to be supportive. And by support, we mean they're structured. You can actually anticipate what's going to happen in the environment. And if you think about music, music can be very structured. It can be chaotic, but you can actually use musical structures to help anticipate, as Dr. Zatorre was talking about before, anticipate where the music's going to go. The second piece is having opportunities for choice and control. And so through music, especially using improvisational strategies or also other tangible choices, if we're following the young child's lead as they're making music, they quickly learn that they're kind of in control of where the music and the play is headed. And then the third piece is that relationship support. And so a big critical element of this particular intervention is that therapist is pulling the parent into the music making experience. And it's much more focused on the give and the take between the child and the parent than between what the music therapist is doing.
So you said that every 2 minutes worldwide, a child is diagnosed with cancer, but the outcomes are better now. But the treatment is still very challenging.
Yeah, so the wonderful thing is that many more children survive cancer than ever before. But it's a very difficult, stressful, prolonged, kind of a protracted experience. So right now, the children that we're working with have acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and that can be like a 2 to 5 year course of treatment for them. And, you know, there's still uncertainty that comes with it, and it's very disruptive to your life.
So how do music therapists turn this stressful environment into a more comfortable environment? I think the statistic you said was up to 75% of parents and 50% of children experience significant stress, really PTSD in a way.
Yeah, so there are, usually, most of the time, parents won't be diagnosed with full PTSD, but they do often experience traumatic stress symptoms. And as you can imagine, it's kind of unimaginable to think about witnessing your child going through cancer treatment. So as we've done interviews with families, like the family that you just saw on the video, they tend to talk about, you know, this terrible suffering that you just kind of have to, we're just working on getting through it. And what happens is that as you are able to, the music therapist facilitates the play sessions with the parents, they talk about how they experience this profound relief in being able to see their child just be a child. Many of them talk about you know, all of a sudden, this is the first time I've seen them laugh or smile, that they begin to really look forward to those sessions. And I think the really exciting thing that we're learning as we talk with parents is that it's not just the time that they spend with the music therapist, but we've had parents talk about little kids ages 3, 4, 5 start to sing to themselves the songs that they've been doing as they're getting ready to go into a stressful experience, calming themselves down because they're remembering that that actually was helpful for them. And then our parents also, you know, are using those strategies outside of the sessions too, which was really kind of the point. So it's always nice when you learn that it's doing what you had hoped it would do for families. Yeah.
So we are definitely going to show the video at the end, if you don't mind. But I'm wondering, in COVID, are you continuing the research? Number one. Number two, where do you think this is going to be in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so COVID has made it difficult, especially when you're doing what we call behavioral intervention research, because we have human contact with people. A lot of the drug trials that are happening with cancer treatments, they didn't get suspended because it's a drug treatment and it doesn't require people to come in contact with people they normally wouldn't come in contact with. We were able to look at translating our intervention for remote delivery, and we can do that as needed. But because we have people coming in and taking additional saliva samples for the cortisol, which is a stress hormone we're measuring, we've had to go through some extra restarts to make sure that all of our families are protected to the greatest degree when we come in.
Yes, yeah. Robert, why don't you please tell us about your research during COVID?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to get together with some of my colleagues and former students. And if we could go to that last slide in my slide deck, we study music, and when the COVID situation first started, actually I was in Barcelona at the time, which was not a good place to be. But everyone has seen these videos, right, of people in Spain and Italy, especially going out onto their balconies and singing. And the question we all had was, okay, people are going out and singing, but you know, what else are they doing? And is singing actually helping them, or is it just, you know, something that makes a good YouTube video, but is it really true? And so we carried out a big survey in 3 countries, in Spain, Italy, and in the USA, with colleagues at NYU and in Barcelona, and also in France and in Tel Aviv. And it was a survey study, and we asked people, well, we give them a list of like 30 different activities, and we asked them to rank order how much each activity helped them, not how much time they spent doing it, but how much each of them helped them cope with the anxiety and stress of COVID. And this is very much in line with what Sheri was just telling us, that the #1 activity across the 3 countries was music, identified by 20% of the population as the single most important thing that they did that helped them to cope. The others were things like exercise, doing calls or video calls with their family, watching entertainment, and cooking.
Cooking. You
Cooking
can combine
also,
cooking with music too.
well, cooking with music is a double whammy, so it's good.
Yes.
And then what we found, which I think is even more important, is that of all those activities, when you look at stress and anxiety outcome measurements, much like Sheri is doing with her cancer patients, we found that there's what you would call a dose response function. The more people listened to music, the less stressed they were. And there was only one other activity which had the same relationship, and that was cooking. So all the other activities, you can do them, you know, and it's fine, but they don't necessarily decrease your anxiety and stress as much as music does. And further investigation showed that this relationship was mediated by the amount of reward that you experience. So very much in line with the mechanism that I sort of suggested earlier, which I think is also the mechanism that's responsible for the positive outcomes in Sheri's patients.
Well, we have a couple of interesting questions. Jennifer asks, my mom passed more than 15 years ago. Why can I hear a whole piece of music in my head, but I struggle to remember her voice?
Oh, that's
Her
interesting.
speaking voice, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say, music is very sticky. It really engages those circuits, and we have a very well developed capacity for listening to music and imagining it, as I mentioned. If you're a musician, that's especially true. I'm a little surprised you wouldn't be able to imagine a loved one's voice, because most people would be able to imagine that as well, especially because you've heard it for so many years. But maybe the voice is a little bit less prominent, because when you're listening to someone, when they're speaking, you're mostly listening to what they're saying. So you can probably very well remember things that your mother told you, because your mothers tend to tell you the same thing over and over if you're misbehaving. But maybe there might be a little bit less attention paid to the voice.
Rosalva in Tucson asks, does music get processed differently in the brain when we're stressed as opposed to when we're relaxed? In other words, does the stress level change the way music is processed?
That's an extremely interesting question. I don't think we know the answer to that, except that based both on what Sheri has shown us and our own experience with the COVID, I would say that the change is probably at the level of the reward circuitry, where you might have a relative inhibition of that system when you're stressed, and the sort of activated system would be the stress response. And so when you get music, you would change the balance between those two.
Well, they say memory is attention. I wonder if that would help then in that case with the stress, because you would perhaps need it more. Sheri, you had a comment?
I was just going to say, sometimes when we're very stressed, our ability to tolerate lots of incoming information can go down. So it's like some people, when they're highly distressed, may not be able to tolerate complex music that requires more mental processing than something that is much more easy, so familiar or more simple. And I've witnessed that before with people who they're in a waiting room in a stressful situation, and they're hearing, not that there's anything wrong with jazz, this was just the example, but there was this jazz music coming from somebody else's office that clearly they felt was a very relaxing piece of music. And I had to walk over and ask them to please, can you turn that down or shut the door, because it's really stressing this person out who told me, I don't know that I can take listening to that anymore.
Oh, interesting. Well, there is preference again.
And something we've noticed in our COVID data, we're still analyzing it, is that there seems to be a preference for not only familiar music, but music from one's childhood or from one's adolescence that might be associated with, periods of our lives when we felt very well taken care of, and very
that makes
warm feelings.
So Charlotte from Sweden wants to know, are there any studies on what kinds of music very young children prefer before they're exposed to certain types by parents or in preschool? Prior to parental training, are there types of music that are empirically more calming?
I don't know of any specific studies. The only thing I'll mention is that some of the attributes of lullabies are pretty universal across cultures, which I think is pretty fascinating. A lot of children's music, regardless of whether it's here in the US or other countries, has very simple structures with, the rise and fall of the melodies very much mirror the, if there's language paired with it. So that's the only thing I'm aware of. I don't know, Robert, if you have anything else to add to that.
No, I would agree with that. I think what happens is, children, the more they're exposed to music, of course, the more they develop the ability to follow those slightly more complex lines. So you want to start off with relatively simple things, like lullabies is a good example. They tend to be very repetitive and rhythmically very well structured, and so that might help with calming a child down. But as the child gets older, once they get into school age, they want something a little bit more exciting too, and their brain is developing, and so their capacity to understand those relationships is also developing. So there should be a match between the child's cognitive development and the music that they're able to handle. And the more they're exposed to music, the more they will develop those tools, and the more sophistication they will have later on to be able to understand different genres, different styles, music from different cultures, and so forth.
Sheri, you and I were both on a panel discussion this past week at the Heart Failure Society of America's annual conference, because we co-authored an introduction to a new study looking at the positive benefits of cardiac patients listening to calming music. It was classical music, and it was in Italy. Just tell our audience about the study findings.
Yeah, so they enrolled about 160 people who had mild to moderate heart failure. They were asked to listen to 30 minutes of music in kind of a relaxed state. They were given access to 80 pre-recorded tracks, and they asked people to do this daily for 3 months. And what they found from that particular study was there was significantly less anxiety and depression, and they had a better mental component score on something that's called the SF-12. But they didn't have any significant differences for their physical, outcome measures that they were looking at for heart failure patients, such as breathlessness or things that were related to their respiratory rate. So I don't know what else you want us to say about it.
Well, that's good, because we talked about the fact that encouragement to sort of train breathing to the music could perhaps help with some of those physical numbers. But it's just so fascinating, this idea, going back to the NIH and their program on integrative medicine and whole person medicine. I think it's really promising based on the science, and certainly your research, Dr. Zatorre. But I want to thank you both, such extraordinary guests, Dr. Robert Zatorre and Dr. Sheri Robb. So we look forward to seeing you again next week. For a reminder, do sign up for the newsletter at my Facebook page or my website, reneefleming.com. And I encourage you to review past episodes of Music in Mind Live on my Facebook page. Next week, we revisit the topic of loneliness and isolation from our very first episode in an exploration of the positive impact of music for pain and mental health. Joining us for this episode is music therapist and professor Dr. Yoka Bratt of Drexel University. Dr. Bratt will discuss her research on the use of music therapy to treat chronic pain. Also joining us will be Dr. Jeremy Noble of the Harvard Medical School and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Noble is the founder and president of the Foundation for Art and Healing and spearheads its signature initiative, the Unlonely Project, created in response to the growing public health concern of social isolation. And former U.S. Representative from Rhode Island, Patrick J. Kennedy, founder of the Kennedy Forum, will join us to discuss his work in mental health advocacy. Tune in live on Tuesday, October 13th at 5 p.m. So we're ending today's episode first with Dr. Robb's second video from the work that she's been doing, which is just extraordinary. I just love this because it really shows how challenging it is for a child and a family in cancer treatment. So we'll start with that. We're also going to preview next week, highlighting the work of Dr. Noble and the Unlonely Project. It's a trailer for this year's 4th annual Unlonely Film Festival, with more than 35 short films streaming online now at unlonelyfilms.org. Enjoy, and we'll see you next week.
Ready? Excellent.
It was something for me to look forward to. I could tell my son, hey, at this exact time, this person's coming and this person's going to do your music. Well, that would make him happy. But then, it was also something for me to look forward to, because when she would come in, it wasn't only his time for things to brighten up. She would explain things like say I was having a conversation with him by myself. Well, there would be things that would easily irritate me, and she would all of a sudden push a different button. It would instantly push the conversation in a different direction. So as soon as that button would be pushed, she would say, oh, well, it's okay, Basile, we don't have to do that. Do you want to do this? But it made you realize that we're not in like an army situation. My son didn't have to be on a routine, which is in the hospital. It kind of gets to that point, like what you would think of when you think of like an army scenario. I mean, he gets up, he gets washed up, he has to brush his teeth, he has to eat, you know, he takes his meds. It becomes just a flat routine. There's nothing enjoyable in it. And because of that, you don't realize it, but your whole life does that. And that lady really made me realize sometimes you need to break away from routine. You need to push the rewind button and kind of let the kid do what he wants, because, you know, you don't realize it, but you're not letting him do anything because he had a routine.
It's our pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the 4th Annual Unlonely Film Festival. Loneliness is the uncomfortable feeling that we don't have the social engagements that we want. It's the gap between the connection with others that we seek and what we actually experience, and it can have devastating consequences.
Loneliness saps vitality, reduces productivity, and diminishes enjoyment of life.
Over half of us are often lonely, and as many as a third of us are lonely right now. The Unlonely Film Festival is part of the Unlonely Project, the signature initiative of the Foundation for Art and Healing, whose mission is to explore and promote the idea that creative arts expression improves the health and well-being of individuals and community.
As a society, we thrive when we are connected.
Now more than ever, we need to connect with one another and tell our stories.
The arts help us engage in meaning and in purpose. They inspire us.
Stories unite us by shedding light on the differences we see and those we cannot see.
So this unique festival and the work of the Foundation for Art and Healing could not be more timely.
We're here to launch something, a streaming film festival called the Unlonely Film Festival, whose goal is to get 1 million people to come see short but powerful films on a topic they would most likely rather ignore. I hope you share our view that we need to move from the grim statistics of loneliness and its painful burdens to doing something about it. And that's what the Unlonely Project is all about.
Everything you do, you will learn from it and you'll use it later on in life.
All of you, you're beautiful. I'm here to prove no matter what you're going through, you're going to all rise above it.